What's up, disciples? Zach Zender here with a fresh episode of Red Letter Disciple, a podcast to challenge you and all the people that you might lead or pastor to be a greater disciple of Jesus. We are continuing with a very Lutheran Church Missouri-centered focus today with Pastor Joe Beran. He's a pastor in Lincoln, Nebraska, and wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Ends of the LCMS, packed with a bunch of data and objectivity to help us look at where we're at today so we can move forward together stronger in the future. We'll look at pastoral formation. We'll look at the shortage we're already experiencing and what's coming. We'll look at the hard facts that 80% of our youth leave the LCMS by the age of 20. What can we do about that? And then we come to a solution that I think is really cool, and I really hope that you love. So thanks for listening today. Today's episode is brought by Red Letter Living. We create 40-day challenges that rock in your church to help your people become greater disciples of Jesus. Our latest one is all about generosity. We just finished the first wave this fall and are hearing some really great results from churches and from individuals that went through this challenge. And we would love to raise the generosity at your church. Imagine, if you're a pastor or church leader, having the funds to fuel your God-sized vision. Imagine your people being generous day in and day out. This is what happens with this resource. And so if that can be a benefit to you, go to redlettergiving.com. We give away free books to pastors, and Lent is coming up. And so New Year's also coming up. Those are both great times to launch a 40-day challenge. Hey, I'd love to hear your feedback on the podcast. What future guests would you like to have on? And leave your comments, your reviews, and your shares and all the platforms you watch from. That makes this thing keep going. So without further ado, let's do this. Joe Beran. All right, well, welcome back to the Red Letter Disciple, a new podcast, new episode, and we're doing things a little different today. We are just filming, recording in my office at the house, and got a great guest today. His name is Joe Beran. He is a pastor at Christ Lutheran in the great state of Nebraska. He's in our nation's capital in Lincoln. I believe he grew up in Nebraska. I'll ask him that in just a moment, how good it is to be back. But he is the pastor at Christ Lincoln for their Yankee Hill campus. He's married. They got 2 kiddos, a boy and a girl. And Joe is also the author of a really great book called The Ends, plural, The Ends of the LCMS. Joe Beran, welcome to the Red Letter Disciple. How is it being back in the great state of Nebraska?
Well, thanks for having me, Zach. It is, in some ways, it is great to be back. It's great to see the state where everybody says go Big Red and is wearing their Husker red. In other ways,
I got my red on today.
Yeah, this thing is happening where I've spent the last 8 years in California, and all of a sudden the lawn was white the other morning. And I had to look, I pointed to my kids, I'm like, this is called frost. It's on the lawn. And my daughter turns to me and is like, is that manna from heaven? And I'm like, no, not at all.
Well, we are glad to have you in Nebraska. Did you grow up in Nebraska? Did I read that right?
Yeah, so I grew up at Christ Lutheran,
Cool.
and the pastor that I'm stepping in to replace is Pastor Jeff Scheich. I grew up under him, and he started kind of a separate campus like 8 or 9 years ago, and so I'm stepping in to fill his shoes in that campus.
That's very awesome. I've been at that campus. It's a really cool spot in a really great neighborhood, and I think you guys are just really well positioned to be a great Lutheran expression that actually can grow in a community. We may talk a little bit more about that later on, but yeah, man, happy to have you back in the great state of Nebraska. Give me like 25 reasons why Nebraska is better than California.
Oh man, I mean, don't get me wrong, California weather's beautiful, but the Nebraska people, the Midwest hospitality, man, Nebraska nice it's pretty nice there. Yeah. But I do miss the PSD at times, okay? Pacific Southwest District is pretty near and dear.
Our state slogan in Nebraska used to be, they changed off of this, used to be Nebraska. It's not for everyone. So, but anyway, it's for you and it's for me for now, which is great.
Well, okay, I got to tag that super quick because it used to also before that be the good life. In my first call out in Santa Clarita, the city slogan was actually where the good life takes you.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I was like, what?
Perfect. Maybe that's where all Nebraskans should be headed then. Maybe we should be going to Santa Clarita. Interesting. Well, hey man, super pumped to have you on. I've been really enjoying having some great LCMS focused conversations. The goal of this podcast is to produce greater disciples. And I've got a heart for disciples, but especially in our denomination. And you wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Ends of the LCMS. And I just devoured this thing literally all last night. And it's like the perfect combination of all of my loves. It's like awesome. It's about Jesus, it's about the LCMS, it's about stats, pastoral formation. And I'm like, this is a really great book. And so I'd love to kind of go back to the genesis of like, how did you, why'd you feel the need to write a book titled The Ends of the LCMS?
Hmm. So there was a few things happening simultaneously in my life. One was a piece of advice that I'd gotten from the pastor that I grew up under, where his first call was in the New York area. And he said the things that he saw in terms of the wider culture, like morality, cohabitation, sexuality, there's like things that he saw in New York that were about 5 or 10 years ahead of the Midwest. Like they eventually kind of made their way there. And in the context that I was at in California, there were a lot of churches that struggled to be able to afford a pastor. It's just a really high cost of living. And there's kind of this snowball effect that happens where it's like you don't have a pastor, so nobody's really shepherding and taking care of the people. And so all of a sudden your church shrinks even more. And at this time, there's a young man who shows up in my office and says, I feel called, I feel led by God to become a pastor. And at the same time, like I'm a data nerd, I found this graph from the ELCA that was projecting their future. And it was, I don't know if you know the one I'm talking about. It came out in 2019 and it was really slim. Like it was their worship attendance by the time they hit 2041 was like, I want to say like under like 100,000 or something across the
That
country
was
on
for
Sunday.
that
It
was
was,
for the entire ELCA,
yeah, for the
which
whole
statistically
ELCA.
what has been 2.5, 3x of what we are, if not more.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Mm-hmm.
right? Wow.
And so there's just all these factors of like, if this ELCA graph is anything like the LCMS or is anything near reality, I have this young man in front of me who there is already 3 or 4 churches that like, if I could train him up like at these churches or find a way to use him in these churches or like find some way that he could plug in, like that way I wouldn't have to ship him off because he was like a year and a half at college, but ultimately just ended up doing, work with his hands kind of stuff instead. And so it's like, I'm going to have to go ship him off back to college for 2.5 years, to go to seminary for 4 years, to maybe not even have a church that can afford him out where I'm at, instead of having him actually participate in the work of ministry where he is needed. So, kind of all these things of the decline, seeing kind of the post Christian reality of California led me to say, hey, I would love to try and have a book that introduces this conversation and says, what can we do about this? Should we change things? Shouldn't we change things? And because I think a lot of times what happens is we do what we've always been doing and we kind of convince ourselves that's the only way it could ever be done.
Hmm. Yeah. And I'm sure by you asking and putting some answers to these questions that everybody's just been super happy with it and fully responsive and only positive. But no, we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think that's a real thing is like books that are written come out of real problems that we're facing in our church, in our churches, in our modern day situations. And so I think that's a big question that I've been pondering lately is things that happen locally, especially when it comes to pastoral formation, which we'll dive into deep in this conversation, is like are the seminaries, do they exist for the churches or do the churches exist for the seminaries? And I think that's a really big question, and I'm not sure that we from an institution side think the same way from the church side, and that could be some of the disconnect. And so yeah, so from your point, like you gathered a bunch of data. Talk to me about the importance of just gathering data to diagnose problems in general in order to kind of bring solutions or recovery to problems.
Mhm. I like data because I think we naturally have a tendency to deceive ourselves, right? I think there's a case to be made about the first article reality of data, where it's like things that God has given us that we can count and measure. Not that we should make idols out of them, right? Like growth can easily become an idol, or data can easily become an idol, but they can instruct us. Like at a very pragmatic level, I can pretend, hey, I think I'm really healthy, but like if my BMI is like over 30, or like my, body fat to muscle composition is one way, like turns out I'm not as healthy as I think. And it takes data to actually really confront me to say, how are we doing in terms of this?
Yeah, I've always appreciated that and think that some of the things we're talking about we're passionate about. We have anecdotal experiences. We're subjective about these things. And all of that's to be expected and is fine. But sometimes I've found that if we're going to kind of look at problems and how do we do things, it's really helpful to get out of subjective, anecdotal, personal opinion, feeling, and like let's look at this from a 30,000 foot view. Let's look at what the numbers are saying, and see if we can just agree on that. Like, do we even have problems or not? And are there even things to solve? And so yeah, I've always loved diving into that part of it and looking at that. Not to say it's the only thing that matters, and not to say that our anecdotal, subjective, our opinions or feelings aren't important, but I think sometimes, yeah, the thing that hopefully can get past that is to look at something objective and say, we have an issue, and here it is. What do we do?
And sometimes it even empowers your anecdotal even better, right? Because I've talked to people who they read the book and they're like, oh, I'm not alone. Like, I'm not the only one that's facing this reality where like our church is struggling, the town's been dying, like this kind of thing is going on. And so sometimes it can be very empowering to say, oh, I'm not alone. There's a lot of us that are walking through this.
And that's good. And honestly, lately I put out a survey, and I've been doing a video series called Voices of the LCMS, because I was feeling like, man, I'm getting a lot of people that are telling me things anecdotally that I'm hearing.
Hmm.
And so let me put some objectivity to this. And what started as just kind of a simple survey actually reached more than 1,000 Lutheran leaders. So now it's like combining, like you said, puts voice to and puts some numbers to some of the voices that we're hearing. And I think that's really what I'm trying to do, is less concerned about my own opinion, though I have one and I think it's important, and you have one and yours is important. But like, how do we like see that there's a lot of people that are saying the same thing, and there's a lot of people that are frustrated, and a lot of people have another idea. And what do we do about these things? Let's continue to talk. And hopefully today's conversation is the continuation of talking. And that's kind of been one of the main points, is let's keep talking to one another, not at one another or about one another. And so awesome, man. Well, yeah, we're going to talk today a lot about pastoral formation and also reaching and retaining our youth and young adults, our younger people. But I think one of the problems is that organizations or institutions don't feel the need to change until they hit rock bottom. And, looking at some of these numbers from an objective brain, like, to me, that's again where I'm like, I think we're already at rock bottom here. And I think that's why some of us are trying to sound the alarms. But one of the cases you make in the book, even from President Harrison in a speech that he gave himself, is 2 years ago, he mentioned that we are in like one of the best financial positions as a denomination that we've ever been in. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering if the leadership and at top is not feeling the crunch. I'm kind of hesitant to believe that the ones stewarding the finances feel like we're at rock bottom. And so I maybe just want you to riff on that a little bit of what have you seen? Are we at rock bottom right now? What have you seen in past about like companies or businesses or anything else objective of like people that were flush with cash that like lost their eye off the ball, if you will?
Yeah. This is kind of a comparison that I make in the book where a lot of times when it comes to different markets, and I know markets are different from the church, but what tends to happen is a company will have dominance for a really long period of time, but then something in the market shifts, and because they've had dominance with a strategy they've always had, they don't move with it, right? The obvious example most everyone can think of if you're over the age of 30 is Blockbuster. Used to be on every corner. How else
Yeah.
could you get DVDs? And like, oh, all of a sudden we're going to mail you the DVDs. Actually, we're going to pipe the DVDs into your computer, into your TV, into your phone. And Blockbuster had the ability to scale that But there was a part of them that said, oh, that shift is something that like that could be existential for us. Think of all the stores that would go under if we did that. Very similarly, Kodak had the technology for the digital camera, but their entire business was built on developing film. And so ultimately, they never did anything with that technology. Another company ends up taking it over, and now Kodak isn't here to this day. Nokia in the phone business, everyone remembers the old Nokia brick phones. Like everybody loved those phones. They were indestructible, but Nokia refused to ever switch to a smartphone model, and so they lost out in their ability to stay in the phone competition.
So
So
what lessons then can the LCMS learn from these beasts that were once titans in their field?
well, I think that there is a tendency for organizations, especially when you're comfortable, when you're cash rich, or when you have kind of a history of this is how we got here, to tend to just keep doing what we've always done or to keep doing what's very comfortable for us and to kind of lose the why behind why they got there in the first place, right? If Blockbuster just realized at the end of the day, we're trying to just get videos and entertainment to our people, well, then they're okay shifting their model a little bit more. Um, and it's interesting because if you look through the history of Lutheranism and the LCMS specifically, we've been historically very dynamic and adapt to change. Like you go back to the 1500s, Martin Luther is like the titan in regards to the printing press. Like this new technology comes out and he uses it in an amazing way to get the word of God out to people, to get the teachings of the faith out to people. You fast forward into the LCMS, into the radio era. Lutheran Hour Ministry broadcast was one of like the most domineering Christian broadcasts in America. We were so quick to jump into that and we did it really well. Similarly, not as many people know this, but even with the TV revolution, we actually had a number of really successful shows early on in TV's era because we were pretty quick to pivot there as well. I don't know that we've done quite as much with the internet revolution and the revolution to social media and the attention economy, but historically we've been, I think, a little more dynamic to adapt. So the question becomes, are we willing to have even conversations on what that could look like, or even to just try tests or experiments to see how they would go?
Yeah, I think that's so wise, and I think it's so easy for us to just get stuck. But to see that that is a part of our history, we've been innovators, and even those companies that you mentioned, they were all innovators at one point, right? Wasn't it? Did you ever read or did you hear there was a chance one time for Blockbuster actually buy Netflix, right? Isn't
Yes,
that
they
right?
could have.
Yeah.
They had the opportunity to buy them and they did not do it. And like within just a few years, then Netflix had the opportunity to do the other the other way around pretty easily. Yeah.
Yeah, and ironically, then the lone Blockbuster store became a documentary on Netflix, like the ultimate humble brag. I think I've heard that so many times, though, the Netflix thing, and how could Blockbuster turn them down? Yeah, looking back, of course, like ridiculous, and they didn't see it. But I also like the same people that make those arguments, like you also could have invested in Netflix at that time, and you would have a whole lot of money. I pulled the stock chart up right here in case anybody's curious, like over the history of when you'd be doing all right if you invested in Netflix there. But and then the other one, yeah, Kodak. Did they not? Was it Kodak that was in the race to do a COVID drug somehow? Like they got their name. I think they
No,
like
I haven't seen where they ended up
completely
as a company.
pivoted and became like a COVID supplier of a drug, which was just super weird. But anyway, it was probably something to learn from there. And I could be wrong, but I think it was Kodak. We'll have to look that
I
up
didn't
later.
know if they were still in the game. That's impressive if they are, man. I assume they went under. Wow.
It's good. And so, yeah, we've been a church body that's been willing to adapt and willing to innovate. And so that's where I want to start kind of with pastoral formation. Because for whatever reason, like you said, I think we've been hesitant to adapt to the internet and to technology of the last 25 years, social media. And we've just kind of fallen behind, in my opinion, in those things. And so I want to talk why and maybe some strategy on that. But give me the lay of the land as we talk about pastoral formation of when it comes, like where it is right now with numbers, how many churches we have, how many pastors, like kind of just lay the land, if you will, of where we are today. Because depending on who you listen to, some are like, we have a real big pastoral shortage. And other people are like, we have we have plenty of pastors.
Mhm. Yeah, so I don't know the specifics off the top of my head. I think there are some things that we can celebrate. So even though if you look at like the net 10, 20 years overall, the amount of pastoral candidates have been very much on the decline. At least in the last couple of years, there seems to be a little bit of an uptick. So that's good. Praise God for that. We're still in a situation where each year about 50 or more calls still go out to the seminary than candidates from the seminary being sent to them. So you still have like 50, 60 churches that are reaching out to the seminary for a pastor and aren't able to get them. And then as a whole across the wider LCMS, I believe we're at about 9.4 or 9.5% of churches that are trying to get a pastor that do not have a called pastor in them. So you think, we have about 6,000 churches. You can kind of do the math on that. We'll round up, and you could say about 600 of them, or just shy of 600, that are without a pastor. And like I said earlier, it ends up breaking my heart because it kind of causes a snowball effect where if you don't have someone shepherding, how much more easily do those members or parishioners say, I'm going to go somewhere where, there's actually somebody who's shepherding here.
Mm-hmm. And that's 9-ish% that don't have a pastor. Included in that, in the ones that do, would be like someone that's doing a dual or even tri
Mhm.
parish. Is that
Or
correct?
you have like another pretty big swath. It's been a while since I looked at this percentage, but of retired pastors or guys that are retired that
Yeah,
still just
that can
help
chip in
shepherd
and
their congregations. Um, the the big shift that's slowly taking place is just we have a lot of baby boomer pastors that are retiring, but then on the flip side of that, we also have a lot of baby boomer parishioners that are retiring or in some cases going to the church triumphant. And so um, the like as I've kind of looked a little more at the data, it's like especially into this next like 5 to 15 years, it seems like there's going to be kind of this need for pastors. But eventually there's going to be a tipping point where all of a sudden it's not just, oh, we have the shortage of pastors for churches that are looking for pastors, but all of a sudden it's, we're starting to have less churches that can actually afford a pastor. So it's 2-point parishes or different things arranged that way.
yeah. And so that's where we are today, 9-ish%. And then, as you said, a bunch retiring, and then not filling as many as we used to. That percentage, I would think, would only increase based on current trends and data, unless something changes. Is that accurate?
Yep.
So yeah, you actually studied like unemployment rate. I kind of found that fascinating in the
Oh,
in
yeah.
the book. So, and I don't know if it's
I'll tell you where the case comes from. Yeah. So, because we, at the last synodical convention, this was a topic of discussion. And one of the things that I hadn't considered before much is a district president who said, well, we need some churches to be without a pastor because if you have a situation where, there's just maybe not the right matchup for a pastor or God's calling him somewhere else, well, like he needs a church that he's able to go to that way. And it kind of struck me because I was a business major back in college. Not that I enjoyed business really, but mostly because I went to a pastor and I said, hey, if you could study anything, what would you study? And he's like, the seminary does amazing at teaching you philosophy and theology and pastoral counseling. And he's like, and then somebody hands you a spreadsheet and expects you to be able to read that thing. And then you have people that you have to like manage or figure out what you're going to do with. And it's like, I didn't learn any of this. So I was a business major back in the day, and I'm like, oh, this actually is a mirror to the concept of unemployment. In a perfect system, you don't actually want unemployment to be zero because it causes the situation where nobody can change jobs. Ideal unemployment rates are usually, depending on your economist that you talk to, anywhere from 2 to 4%. So there's a little bit of fluidity in the market and people can change jobs that way. But where we would be at currently at like 9.5%, like that is the levels of unemployment that you would see in like in the recession, right? The 2008, 2009 crisis or during COVID.
yeah, and that's where we are currently. And again, um, I completely agree with you. The last couple of years, I think across the board in Christianity and with Gen Z, and even being on site for the opening ceremony service for this last round of seminary students a few months ago. Yeah, there's a vibrancy to it, and it's not dead by any means. What's happening on residential, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm advocating that we completely abolish that program in any of the videos or conversations that I'm having. But even still, it's not producing the amount that it used to. And with those that are retiring, or as you said, going to a greater place, that number is only going to get higher and higher and higher. And so a lot of us are looking at this saying, what can we do? What can we do now? Years ago, I was thinking proactively, but now it's like we're not even proactive. Like, just what can we do now? And obviously, the book that you created, I'm sure you've heard lots of different opinions for, against. And so I'd kind of love to talk about like what are the arguments, the top arguments you're hearing against new pathways, and then we'll start there. And then what are the arguments you're hearing for new pathways? And so let's go against first, because I'm a negative person. I want to start against.
Yeah, I think the first major one that I hear is essentially, why in the world would you ever lower the bar on pastoral training, right? Like, if theology is too important of a task to piecemeal, it's too important of a task to say, like, oh, you can learn it online. This is going to lead to inevitable heresy or just really faulty slipshod theology in our church body. There's recently kind of I think you might have had the one of the major writers or leaders of Ad Crucem. There was a recent blog post about this from somebody that has experienced a form of digital education in the LCMC, saying, hey, I'm nervous because it seemed like for this digital education, the bar was not high enough. And so we had sloppy theology entering into our church body because of this. And if your heart is somebody that you say, I care deeply about making sure that the gospel is rightly preached, that we don't have some false gospels or some incorrect theology about who Jesus is entering into our church body, my practical question for you would just be this. In which of these cases do you think that there's going to be a little bit more incorrect theology? A case where we have about, like right now, about 1 in 10 of our churches who don't have a called pastor. And so you're trying to get whoever you can to come in and preach that's like retired or has some
Mhm.
theological education. But eventually what ends up happening, eventually you have a Sunday or 2 or 3 where you can't find the retired guy to come out, or you can't find that person. And who do you end up calling? Uneducated layperson who maybe has been, all in on the Bible Network and is going to preach about, Israel and Revelation and these sorts of things and just go all wonky all over the place, or to say, hey, we've created this digital pathway, actually out of, like you had helped on earlier, maybe out of professors that have taught historically rightly within our body, and know the level of expectation that we have for our pastors that way. Which of these do you think is going to have happen with a higher frequency in terms of incorrect theology that way? Especially because if you are nervous about saying, hey, we don't want this incorrect theology to happen, there's definitely testing you can do, continuing education conversations to be had. Like, there's different bars or things that you could create that could say, hey, this is going to help speak to that reality.
Yeah. So, okay. So lowering the bar, that's kind of one of the big ones. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, I feel like sometimes a lot of people, when we talk about new pathways, that they go there and they think that if we're doing it online, that it would be some sort of lesser training. And I would say probably the same with residential or any sort of in-person learning experience. There's good classes and bad classes, good professors and bad professors, right? And so I'm not advocating, I don't think many of us are advocating for lowering the bar, or for, less theologically trained pastors. Yeah, anyway, okay, so lower the bar. That's one of the
That's
top
one. Yeah,
arguments.
sorry, that's just one of them.
Yeah.
The other I've kind of read, hey, if we fragment how pastors are trained, are we risking fragmenting the church, right? Is this just everybody doing what's right in their own mind? And yet and this is like, there's been language that's been thrown out in the past around like, oh, these are like rogue seminaries and things like that. It's one of those where I think I'm on the one hand really sympathetic to that, but on the other hand, like if we weren't willing to take a chance on, Fort Wayne existing, and having a practical seminary in our past, then like, and we were to say, whoa, 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 we never want more than one seminary because we never want to fragment our body, we would have way less missional impact in pastors to this day. So,
Because that
I,
one, because yeah, tell the history of the Fort Wayne that came out of a need and some or what? How did
yeah,
that
yeah.
start?
So it was Leah in Germany that actually ended up being this pioneer of the practical seminary that way in Fort Wayne. And Fort Wayne's history, as when it began a very kind of practical way, is fascinating because like the need for pastors was so great that they graduated, like if I remember correctly, and this is, you can look at Mike Newman's Gospel DNA book for this, like half the class after the very first year, they're like, hey, we need pastors, just go, go, go. And they, another like third the year after that, the guys who went all the way through went into seminary not knowing how to read and write for some of them.
Mm,
So like, which even that is crazy. Like you couldn't get
yeah.
anywhere near a seminary if you didn't have that educational kind of a barrier nowadays. So, that is something that like it's an amazing story of saying, hey, we see this need for pastoral formation, and we're just going to do something that has been pretty historical in our church body that way. And then you also have the story of Springfield too. Seminaries there for a while. It's always interesting to talk to guys that came from Springfield, and um, I think sometimes what happens too is when it comes to seminary education, we just kind of um, assume that things have always been the way that they are when that's not always kind of the case. So, like on one level, before the Masters of Divinity, you also had the before it the Bachelors of Divinity. And you could go to a Concordia and our Concordia system for 2 years and then kind of have this expedited path through the Bachelors of Divinity that way. Now, the ATS, the Association of Theological Schools, made that shift to say, no, this is going to be a Master's of Divinity, and we're going to change it so it's more challenging to be able to do the prep work that way. But what's always fascinating to me is that wasn't like us as a synod saying, hey, we want this, higher theological bar. That was the ATS who we want to make sure we're accredited through
Mhm.
doing it that way. Or even if you go really back historically. So I was at the conference with the ACELC. I'm super grateful. They even let me speak or have a voice at their conference to talk about pastoral formation. And in it, they talked about the pastoral formation methodology of Johann Gerhard. And it's so fascinating because in his day, so he's kind of following Luther, and in his day, they realized that when they sent guys to seminary and they would stay the full 4 years for education, that oftentimes they would be so educated they wouldn't be able to properly speak and communicate the gospel to the peasants. And so your average length of stay for pastoral education in Gerhard's day was like 1.8 years, not even a full 2 years. But it's because they saw, hey, this is what we need. And I love Gerhard's process because it's the heart of seminary is to be informed by the word was at the very core of it. So it was very beautiful. Anyway,
That's cool. Lowering the bar, fragmented. Anything else? Arguments against new
the
pathways?
last would just be who ensures that the students really form faithfully. How do you make sure that this guy is going to be up to snuff, that it's not going to be like a situation where every church does what is right in their own eyes and then just raises up guys that do things that are right in their own eyes. So what's going to be and this kind of goes back to the first question, which is kind of this question of like, what could you create that would be that externalized force that would make sure that students are of a high enough.
Yeah, it's good. And so kind of what I'm hearing you say in those even arguments against, though, is that the way we're doing it now has not always been the way we've done it, and at some point we positioned to it. And is it still the most effective way? Yeah, it can be very effective, but we're living in a different day of age than we once were, and so. I'd love to hear then, kind of on the flip side, what arguments are you hearing, for new pathways? And I'll just put my cards out on the table with the survey, especially that I put together. Is I'm a big proponent, and we need to find more pathways to reach more people and to reach people where they're at. And in the survey that I polled, 1,054 leaders, 65% were in favor of doing an online MDiv and it was a very small percentage that were against it. And so there is a large number of people, Lutheran leaders, especially from our larger and growing congregations, that see a need for an online MDiv. So what are the arguments you're hearing for why they would, or why new pathways would be important?
Mhm. Yeah. So I think that one of the big ones is we'll do it on the like negative and the positive. The first is like the negative side. There's something about making a church wait like 1 to 3 years for a pastor, that the amount of just momentum shift and loss and sometimes pain throughout that process can just be a difficult thing for a church. And then on the flip side of that too, when we don't have enough pastors, and this could be a separate reason, but when we don't have enough pastors just to fill the spots of calls for churches in our synod, we are not regularly sending pastors out in the places that are growing within our synod. So if you look back historically with our church body, there's a number of times where St. Louis had so many graduates that they will say to a guy, hey, you're going to go work in the steel mill, and we want you to try and plant a church while you're doing that. Why? Well, there's just too many graduates. There wasn't a church for them, and then they just trusted, okay, we think God is going to be able to use you to do this. Now, that's like a call that, like, if you told me, hey, Joe, you're going to go, work at a steel mill and try and gather guys together, that is deeply intimidating. And yet it is trusting that God is going to be able to do something that way. So like we lose a lot of those proactive opportunities where you could go start a church when we don't even have enough guys just to fill the churches that currently exist. You kind of just are forced to only play defense that way.
Yeah.
Second argument I've heard for a new pathway is there are confessional Lutheran churches that not only have this model currently, so you look up to our Canadian friends to the north that have a model like this currently. You look at the story of like the early church's pastoral formation, or even you look around the world, even to the global south, like in Tanzania, or Mkana Yesu is one of the bigger church bodies. Granted, there's some big differences that we have with them. Where pastors are first trained locally with their communities under supervision. And this is not actually that foreign or new of a thing as we think it is.
Mhm.
So I think we have a real opportunity to actually learn from the global south in some of this in terms of how they're doing things and how they're empowering leaders that way.
Yeah. Any other ones? Yeah.
Yeah, the last one's a little bit more personal, which is people start to fall in love with Lutheran theology. I am nervous sometimes that we're locking them out. So in my last context I was in California, I had somebody who was in the same town as me. Long story short, because of some life circumstances, fallen in love with a woman and other things, ended up going from St. Louis to a digital seminary route. And he holds to LCMS beliefs, especially around women's ordination in these topics. But he couldn't be in the LCMS because we're not comfortable with that. Very similarly, I had somebody that I was talking to recently that dated a girl, like ended up marrying a girl that was raised in the LCMS, but he was a non-denominational church planter. And this is not a guy I knew. This is like somebody connected me with this. And he ended up connecting to a pastor here, and we've been in conversation. And he's like, so here's the thing. And this is so funny because the way, like, he just called me, he's like, so I've been reading the early church fathers, and it's just brought me to this conclusion that Lutheranism is the correct interpretation of Scripture. And I'm
Nice.
blown away at this. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. I'm so impressed. That's awesome. And so, like, we're starting to talk about this and the situation he's in and where he feels like God's kind of calling him in this season. And I start to realize, oh no, you've only been serving your current church body that's non-denominational for like a year and a half, 2 years. You feel like God's calling you to go and serve this like inner Kansas City community that is in need, and is like, it's one of those like nobody's going into this because it's a very least of these area. You think our theology is correct and right and true, and our confessions are right, but I'm going to have to either actively take you out of where you feel God, like it seems like God is calling you to ship you off to the seminary for 4 years, like, or you're going to have to just look somewhere else, which is yeah, as not great alternatives.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm concerned, yeah, especially, when we talk about new pathways, I'm just concerned that if we don't come up with more new pathways, that w- we're going to lose so many of our like-minded people that have a great heart and that actually do love Lutheran Church Missouri Synod theology. But because it wasn't convenient and it wasn't available in a way that they needed, and other theology of other denominations that may be closely linked to ours was, they're just going to move over there. And it's for the kingdom, I suppose. All of it's fine, because great. But for our church body to continue to be a force, or hopefully to be a force again one day, like it's like we're just going to keep losing. I was talking with a friend of mine here locally in Omaha that grew up LCMS, and great LCMS guy, had a church that he was in the LCMS that he grew up with that he didn't love, and then had a church that he did love, and he was thinking about ministry, and went to college, and he ended up leaving the LCMS not because he hated the LCMS or anything was wrong with the LCMS. There was just no LCMS ministry. But who was there was the Navigators, and he got linked in with them. And then he began planting a church and started a church after attending seminary that made sense to him. And he's now gone on to plant 20 churches. And like, it's like, man, this guy was ours. He was LCMS. And because we weren't valid and available and active at especially the college age, which we'll talk about youth and young adults here in just a moment. But I'm just curious, like how many people we're losing because we're kind of sticking to the models and not willing to adjust or adapt, and then others are, and they're getting our best. Thoughts?
Yeah, I both agree from that perspective, and then the other kind of secondary perspective is maybe this isn't as much the case in the Midwest, but I think a little bit more so in the West Coast, in those areas where cost of living, or in a lot of more urban areas where cost of living gets higher and higher. Um, if you want churches to be able to have pastors who are also tent makers or bivocational or another career, sometimes you are actively asking them to sabotage that career on the way to like, yeah, not that that should be the same. Like, we're not out in this to make money at the end of the day, that's for sure. But it's something worth contemplating.
Yeah, if you get a ministry to make money as your primary reason, there's better options. Please go elsewhere. It'll save everybody a lot of trouble. That's for sure. Yeah, no, it's good, and that's where I look at things that are starting. Like Mike Newman was on the podcast not too long ago, and I was asking him like, there's a bunch of voices like mine that are just honestly tired, and we're 40 to 49 years old, so we've been in it long enough to know how the game works, but also we want to stay in it longer, and we're just not seeing things change. And how do you change institutions? How do you? And he said the best thing you can do is just create problems. And create problems, because problems force change, and that's where I have a lot of compassion and support for something like the Center for Missional and Pastoral Leadership, Simple, because they're creating a problem, and what they're doing is they're teaching really great Lutheran theology to people who want to learn that Lutheran theology. And to me, at the end of the day, if we care less about titles and ordination, but have more trained up Lutheran theologians in the world, at the end of the day, the kingdom's better for that. The LCMS may not be, but the kingdom is better for that. And at some point, if there's a whole bunch of people going through that program, at some point we've got to shift and recognize like we can actually keep all of these in house and change our synod. And so anyway, that's where I'm like, let's keep creating problems. And to your point, we've had innovation in the past. We've done these things in the past, and now feels like a pretty ripe time to be doing some new stuff. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I always go think back to history. Like, if Walther would have been a little more, what do you mean you're looking at starting something in Fort Wayne and raising up more pastors out there? We're not comfortable with that. We don't have enough doctrinal control and superiority, like, and intentionality over that. There's no way. It'd be a very different synod today.
Yeah, it's good. So one more question on the pastor thing. What do you say to the people that say the LCMS doesn't need more pastors because it's declining? Which is true. Tim Wood from Ad Chrism, I think is it Chrism, is that how you say it?
I think so.
Anyway, that's how I say it. He was on a different podcast on the line with Brian Stecker and mentioning some data around worship attendance, how in the last 25 years, from his best estimates, that we've gone from 1.1 million people sitting in our churches on Sunday mornings to closer to his estimate 425 to 475,000 people in a quarter of a century. And so, yeah, we're in decline pretty rapidly, which is why some of us are like, feels like rock bottom. Let's do some stuff. But the flip side of that then is his assessment seems very much to be like, we don't need new pastors because we don't have as many people. So yeah, I'd just love to hear your kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's kind of I've listened to a few of his interviews, and Tim's
It's
one of
his
those like
voice, right?
voices where
His
it's
voice
like,
draws you in, right?
oh yeah, his voice draws you in, and then like he's just super unafraid to say hard things in a
You're
beautiful
right.
way. One of those like
Yeah.
honestly brash individuals, and so like he has a metaphor of essentially like, if my sales force was like, like lost 50% of their sales, like I would consider, grave changes then. So Tim gets even like harder than I do on the system that way. So I think the reason why I'm not comfortable making that shift of saying, oh, we need less pastors because it's declining, is to say I think that is a strictly defensive mindset, right? When you have both from, I'll do the compassionate pastoral side, which is like, if we really believe that AC 14, that like the word rightly preached and the sacraments, right, are around that rightly called pastor, then that would mean that like 1 in 10 of our churches are not receiving that. They don't have the rightly called pastor there, which is crazy. Like that should break our hearts. That should keep us awake at night. But then on the other side of things, we have a lot of offensive opportunities that I think we miss out when we are always just playing defense and not actually thinking proactively, right? So I think of, my vicarage contacts with Tim in Arizona and Gilbert area, where it's like, okay, here's a fast expanding part of America that if we plant churches, it seems like God can do something amazing there. There's people showing up that you can actually do like hey, we're gonna put, flyer the doors, or like we're gonna like there's a lot of things that you could do there that you get away with that maybe is just a little more challenging in the Midwest or other kind of contexts that aren't growing at the same scale. We lose out on those opportunities because we're not even backfilling our positions for just the places that we have right now. That's the place that I think it kind of grieves me the most, because it's like even where I'm at, I'm really grateful that this church said, hey, we're going to look out to where Lincoln is expanding, and we're going to seek to plant a church in that area because we think, as it continues to grow and expand, there are going to be people there that are looking for a church. And it's that kind of forward thinking that sometimes pays just huge dividends.
Yeah, and in your context in Lincoln, there's going to be a lot of people coming in pretty sad from the night before that need some hope. Because the Huskers just, yeah, again,
Oh,
another rough year. Next year,
yeah,
hopefully.
that's brutal. But
But I
we've
like
needed hope
that.
for a long time. Thank the
Yeah,
Lord for the
yeah.
cross.
But I like that offensive minded posture though too, because we gotta plant more churches. Planting churches from the book of Acts, take out denominations, has been the number one strategy to reach new people for Jesus. And I just heard earlier today on a podcast that there are what we've said it already, 5,900 ish or something congregations in our synod, and I think we planted 67 new churches in the last year, which 67 is okay as a number, but when you look at how many churches we have, that's like 90 plus churches for every one church plant. Like we've got to figure out how do we get that number down and how do we
Mhm.
network together. And especially, as I'm thinking through, and again, I shouldn't speak to any with any expert opinions, but if we are sitting in a cash flush position, like why can't we use those dollars to plant new churches and to invest in our future? And especially, let's pivot to talk about youth and young adults.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that. Go you were going to say something else though
Super
first.
quick. I do think there's some intentionality starting to be made on these things. I don't know if it's the same. Like when I was in the seminary, they did have a church planning track that they were very intentional about. I don't know if they still have the same track today. I know there were some changes made around my fourth year there, but I
What
do
year did you
think
graduate?
That would have been 2017.
2017. Okay. Yeah, it was 2010. And there was the talk of starting one, but it hadn't officially started yet at that point.
Hmm. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's go to youth and young adults.
Well, and because of that, a lot of us, myself included, have had to look outside for kind of church planting network resources. And there's some really great ones with Acts 29. That was a big one in the days I was at seminary. And then ARC conference has been pretty big in church planting. But yeah, so the number one challenge voiced in my survey was how do we reach and retain youth and young adults? And so you referenced a study in your book, I think done by Lyman Stone. Does that sound right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
tell me about his study and one of the key findings that came out of that.
Yeah, so if you are a Lutheran data nerd, the Lutheran Religious Life Survey by Lyman Stone, he is awesome, very diligent, thorough. Check out the Lutheran Religious Life Survey. He does one every year, and his very first one. So I guess this is like the second part from the story at the very beginning, where I saw that one on the ELCA, and internally I'm like, oh my goodness, this is so heartbreaking. Well, Lyman just the very next year actually put one out for the LCMS that has
Mm.
different projections about our future. He's a great voice to talk about these sorts of things. But he points out, I think one of the most key findings of his is that by the numbers of, I think he uses like breakdown of congregations and a few other data sources. He has a stat that 60% of children that are baptized in the LCMS will be gone before they reach confirmation age. And if you extend that out to the age of 20, about 80% of kids who are in the LCMS are gone by the time they reach age 20. I talk about this a little bit in my book because historically there's this like really stupid debate that happens of like, is it that we should reach the lost more? Is it that we should like have more kids? Like, well, what if we did this? What if we did this? Well, they just think this, they just think that. And it's like, okay, when we're losing this high of an amount, like both and whatever, get past that silly debate and let's actually address like this elephant of how many kids are just leaving the church.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've said on videos before that absolutely, if you're in the baby making industry, world, age, like, yeah, go for it by all means. That's not a, but for me, what I don't like is when that comes off as our number one evangelism and growth strategy. I think it's incredibly limiting. I think it's and part of it too is knowing the backside of that. Okay, cool. We have a lot of kids. And then once we have them, we can't keep them and we're
Mhm.
struggling to keep them. And so if that's the best evangelism growth strategy, uh, it's not working. So like we got to do something else. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying and probably why people are kind of sounding the alarm too on the survey of like, we've got to figure out this reaching and retaining youth and young adults thing. Because for whatever reason, we're not being effective in that area. And so any thoughts on how we can be more effective or how we can write those numbers in a better direction?
Well, I think anybody who says like, "Oh, I have the secret sauce," that's the answer to that is like trying to sell you something. But
Shoot, I was just coming out with a book called The Secret Sauce: How to Reach and Retain Youth and Young Adults. So
I
shoot.
do think there's like I think there's practical things that you can see from data, and then there's also kind of just things to keep in mind. From the numbers, things like intergenerational relationships in churches are actually super valuable when people in churches actually have close, meaningful connections and relationships. And this comes from, I think this is from Barna's data in like 2009, 2010 for the millennials, that they found that those that had connections and relationships with people outside of their age range actually made a huge difference when they had leaders that way. Um, there is some data that essentially says like if you empower kids, if you trust them into different like leadership positions or to own different aspects of ministry, it makes a really big difference in terms of their likelihood to own their faith and to see it in the future that way. I think one of the reason why we like have the frustration that we run into with this a lot is even just kind of the wider like with that post-Christian American context comes this shift of like the church as less and less and less of a priority, where even the way that they've measured regular church attendance on surveys has had to change from like over 4 times a month to 4 times a month to like 2 times a month is regular church attendance. So even that stat has had to shift. And then the other kind of thing that I think is helpful to keep in mind, there's a book called Apologetics at the Cross. And it has one chapter in particular called Engaging in Late Modernism. If you're a ministry leader, I'd encourage you to read it, because there is kind of this misnomer that happens sometimes, I think, where people say the problem is the education system in our colleges. It's that Christians go off to college and they don't come back. Actually, if you look at the numbers, and this is from The Great Dechurching, another, if you're a Christian, data nerd, a great book to check out, that's actually not the case in terms of if you are a Christian who goes off to college, you're actually more likely to keep your faith than if you were a Christian that didn't go to college. There's something about kids dropping off at the end of that high school age as they gain independence. And the thing that Apologetics at the Cross does really well is kind of paint some of the pictures as why that is. So they have 4 different categories they look at. First is modern pluralism, and this could be a whole podcast. I'm sorry, I won't take all day on this. Second is the ethics of authenticity. So like we live in this hyper individualistic culture that says that it's my feelings and individuality that needs to be expressed and realized. And you combine that with the rise or the triumph of the therapeutic. And religious lethargy are the 4 that kind of create this system where God is not really sure there's a God, because there's a lot of world religions out there, and I don't even know that this was that important to my parents, and really, doesn't God just kind of want me to not do bad and to feel good at the end of the day? And they just, with all of those things combined, so easily miss the heart of Christianity, and especially because Christianity speaks so beautifully to each and every one of those things.
Yeah, it's good, bro. It's really good. And Joe, your book came out in 2023, was it? Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Have you done much looking since you wrote? Sometimes when I write a book, I'm like, cool, I wrote the book and now I'm never going to look at this again. So sometimes I do that with some of the content I write. But have you studied much of what's happened in the last couple of years? Because I would say even since 2023, you're starting to see these really encouraging and positive trends when you look at Gen Z and younger audiences, that they're open to faith, and they're actually more regular attendee. I saw this one the other day, that they're attending more regularly than even boomers. If they do go, they're attending more frequently. And so I'm seeing all this positive trends and movement in this generation coming up, and it feels like a lot of the stuff they're looking for, our church body can provide. And yet, anecdotally, I hear of a few things, but overall, I feel like we're kind of missing the moment. Are we not? Or maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. The Gen Z thing is interesting. So the church that I'm in, it's interesting because it was a church that on the worship stuff was a little more early adopter-ish to how do we have what would be on the radio or those kind of things, right? To contemporary or whatever you want to call it. And I was talking with a pastor at one point, and they were a little bit almost kind of weirded out, because they're like, dude, I see these kids nowadays, and it's they look for the ancient things. They look for they want the traditional. Give me the Lutheran service book. Give me the historic. And I think there's a part of that, and this might be a really reductionistic explanation, but I do think that every generation to some degree rebels against the generation before it, right? So maybe for some baby boomers, it's no, worship can look this way. It can be a little bit different. You can have freedom in terms of how you express the beauty of the gospel and what we have that way. Well, all of a sudden it's shifted back to I don't want a kind of worship that looks anything like the culture around me. I want something that is historic and different, because I realize how beautifully different the gospel is. It's having conversations about religion in my lifetime has been very different than I thought it would be. So I grew up in public schools here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and my experience growing up is when you would talk about Christianity, you'd really get kind of three results. You get like, oh, we kind of go Christmas and Easter, or I kind of know what it is. I just don't care much about it. They're like, I'm all in for my faith. I'm a diehard for this. And then like the other big one was like, religion is the opiate of the masses. Shut up about it. I don't want to hear it. Right. It was like very kind of guttural. And so when I moved to California, I assumed like, oh, that's probably, what I'm going to get. And yet over and over when like I talk to people out there and you have your inevitable like, so what do you do for a living point? And I'd say, oh, I'm a pastor. They would love to talk about spirituality. They would love to talk about different questions that they had. And there's just a spiritual, like even for those that maybe aren't like religiously vigorous in their faith, even for Gen Z that are a little bit just unsure of things, they're more none in their faith, None, they are still really religiously curious.
Yeah.
And they crave an authentic faith that says, this just looks different. There's something about the way these people act and live and what they do that's just different.
It's good. And I'm encouraged, like, that I'm seeing this sudden, it feels like a sudden change, because I think what it means, if it is true, and I don't doubt that it is, if it is true, then it means like we can these trends can be reversed, especially, I mean, we have the Holy Spirit on our side too, working with us and for us. And so it should not feel hopeless, but it also means like we may be in the moment right now where decisions that we make today, or in the next few months or year, could be extremely pivotal in shaping new trends for our synod. And so that's where I'm like, gosh, all this data seems to be pointing in the right direction for the younger generation. And yet I don't know that from a synodical standpoint, we're set up for that. So let's say we do. We get a lot of Gen Z, the younger Gen Z that's growing up through high school and finishing high school now and going up into college soon. And they want to be pastors, but they're serving at churches that are, that they love, and they don't want to leave those churches because that's what they know, and they want to do ministry in their city. And if we don't have answers that are convenient and helpful for them, and if they're not willing to quote sacrifice or move for 4 years and pay the cost that everybody's got to pay, which is like made up stuff that we made up to suffer, I'm just like, man, they're just going to go somewhere else then that's close, but not us. And again, kingdom is fine, but it feels like we're missing the moment, even though like things can change rapidly, and this could be a very pivotal time. So yeah, let's kind of wrap up then. If you were the leader and could do anything you wanted with our synod, what are a couple changes or things you'd do?
Anything I
You've
want
studied
with our
it.
synod.
I'm doing a big one, big question here. You've had the data, you've diagnosed the problem. It's time to recover. So what are the top 2-3 things that like we can act on these things in the near future?
So I think the first thing that pops into my head is I don't know that I would. So like, one, I don't know that I ever trust myself with like to be leader of the synod that way. I don't think I have the maturity of what that takes. Even like with like seminary presidents and stuff like that, at the end of the day, I think everyone's trying the best they can to be accountable to Jesus for the things that they do and to make sure they're trying to be faithful to him in their context. But I think I would just start running a ton of different experiments, right? So I would start running experiments in terms of church planting tracks, and then on top of running those experiments, I would try and find out ways that I can just share stories of what people are doing well or what's succeeding, not from a standpoint of like, oh, growth is the only thing that matters. Like growth can easily become an idol, but just to say, hey, we tried this thing and wow, it seems like this thing's working out really well, right? So like, oh wow, there's people opening up classical schools because people want a more traditional historic education. Cool. Tell me the story of how that came apart. I want to hear the story of how that happened. I don't only want to hear that story. I want to record it, and I want people to share it so that if somebody feels called to do something in their context, they can know what that could look like or how it's going. So run experiments in terms of different pastoral formation, different planting methods, and different ways to get churches to work together in doing those things, and then find ways to tell stories to celebrate the successful things that are happening within those.
I love it, bro. I think that's fabulous. Let's run some experiments. let's keep our hands open and trust one another and run some experiments and test them and report on them and figure out what works and what doesn't work. And what I would say, if anyone's listening out there that has any voice or sway, like we just can't do the same thing and expect different results. We've got to do something different, and to me, the time is right for that. And so let's run some experiments. I'm going to be running an experiment in 2026. I'm pretty excited about it. I'm not ready to share what it is yet, but a teaser for folks. It's going to be awesome. So, a little teaser there. But hey, anything that I didn't ask you or that you'd want me to ask, or anything you want to kind of share as we kind of wrap up to, yeah, to our church body
Um,
leaders and listeners?
well, this isn't, like I said, I'm not going to assume that I have the thing to dictate to church body leaders or whoever. I think one thing that's helpful as we think through things moving forward is just to realize that there's been different moments in the church's history where like something's happened that's tended to shift things a little bit, right? So the printing press comes out, and all of a sudden, with the invention of the printing press, well, now information can be at the fingertips of people in a language they can understand it, unlike ever before. And so here's Martin Luther, who says, I'm developing this book for the heads of the household to be able to teach their kids the key lessons of the faith and instruct them, and what the scriptures is all about. It's beautiful that way. Well, all of a sudden now we're at this point where it's not that information is being spread by books, but instead where the switch is flipped. And now it's that there's so much information that is out there all the time that everybody, I love the way that economists say it, because they say the shortest resource, the things that people will fight over, is now your attention, right? And so shepherding in a time where the attention economy exists, that is to say, there's all these people that their single-handed one thing that they want the most of is your attention, because if they have your attention, they can feed you advertisements and try and get you to buy things. It's another one of those huge monumental technological shifts that I think there are some implications for how we disciple, how we do community. The need for community is crazy right now that the church just has huge opportunities for.
Yeah. Agreed. And that's why I love like friends that are doing stuff online, just trying to figure out their own way to get our Lutheran theology out there,
Mm-hmm.
because everyone else is. And if we say we got great Lutheran theology, let's get it out there. Let's not be afraid of it. Let's train up some theologians indirectly, directly. Let's get them degrees. Let's get them titles if we need to, but also let's just put Lutheran theology out there and get it into the hands and hearts of a lot of people. So, hey, Joe, we ask all our guests this question, that if you could challenge every listener to do one thing this week to be a greater disciple of Jesus, what would you challenge them to do?
Oh, it's so funny because the answer that popped in my head, I listened to a podcast you had previously, and it was the one in that podcast of be doers of the word, don't just be hearers of the word,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
be hearers of the word, be doers of the word. But I want to take it a step further and say not only to be engaged with regularly reading the word and being informed and surrounded by the word, but also to say, do you have a relationship in your life that you get to be the hands and feet of Jesus to that person, right? Is there somebody in your life that you have that relationship with, whether it be in your neighborhood, an old friend, whoever, somebody who is disconnected from the body of Christ, that you have an opportunity to show the love of Jesus in that relationship? And if not, go make a friend, do whatever it takes, find a new hobby, knock on your neighbor's doors with some cookies, do what it takes.
that's good. Listeners, if you take on that challenge, let us know. Hashtag Red Letter Disciple, or email us hello@redletterchallenge.com. If you have any comments or questions that you don't want to put in the YouTube comments below, if you're watching on YouTube but you'd like to send our way future guests around these topics, email us at hello@redletterchallenge.com. We want to support you along the way. Joe, if people want to connect with you and your work, where can they find you, and where can they grab this? I'm not just blowing smoke. This really helpful, I feel like really fair book called The Ends of the LCMS.
Yeah, so just Google Ends of the LCMS or go to Amazon. That's where you'll find it, amazon.com, Ends of the LCMS. So check it out there. Man, it stinks because I don't have a great email's probably the best way. joe.beran@gmail.com. I hate email, but that's a whole other rant separately. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. All right, brother. Well, thank you, Joe, so much for doing the work, putting the work in, studying the data, helping us answer and look at some really powerful questions. I do believe it's going to help our church body and our synod move forward as we walk together. So appreciate you, man. Have a
Thanks,
great
Zach.
day, and go Big Red. Amen.
Go Big Red.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast with Joe Beran. And hey, I'd love to hear what you think of the new format. A little less polished, a little less produced, but hopefully some really great, passionate conversations that are going to help people become greater disciples of Jesus, especially right now in our church body, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Hey, we've got a great few episodes coming up. Some names to keep in mind for future episodes are Jeff Cloa, Tim Wood, a data expert, going to be talking to me about some of the data he's been running, and I'll share a little bit about what I've been doing. It's going to be a great conversation. We've got Brian Friedrich, the president of Concordia St. Paul, guests like Tanner Olson coming up, and more. So don't miss the next episode of Red Letter Disciple. You can subscribe or follow on whatever listening or viewing platform it is that you enjoy, and we'll be back next week with a fresh episode of Red Letter Disciple. Have a great week.